basically ran through it and caused all the dust to come up. And you know why it did it? Because he was a Bible believer who started studying all this stuff and said, you know something, if this stuff is supposed to be taken at face value, what does Psalm 82 really mean? What does Psalm 46 really mean? When it talks about the sons of God, wait a minute, this is like this passage and that passage, and if you actually take them for face value, they're talking about heavenly things, not earthly things.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody, to the Buried Bible Podcast. I am, as always, your layman, Keegan Walls, with the man himself, Mark Chavalas, the doctor. You're not impressed. No. Anyways, we are back to talk Nephilim, and so I don't think I brought it up last time, but I want to find out if I'm the only one. Every time I say the word Nephilim, I think heffalumps from Winnie the Pooh. And Mark thinks that I'm the only person who thinks that, so I need to know if I'm just crazy. But every time we talk about Nephilim, I don't know, maybe it's my ADD, I just over and over think the heffalumps.
And you will be answering the queries. I will be avoiding that like the plague.
Yeah, if you guys jump in the comment section about this heffalump thing, I'll make sure to reply.
I'm waited with bated breath.
There you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're back to continue our topic on the Nephilim, and we want to look at a few questions. We want to look at continuing to see, are the Nephilim in any other ancient texts? I know we spent a lot of time talking about the Book of Enoch last time, and we want to ask the questions: are there any other ancient Jewish texts that we see the Nephilim? What did the early church fathers think of this? And then even go outside that and look specifically at Mesopotamian texts. So I'll turn it over to the doctor himself, and let's get comfy and talk Nephilim.
Well, today's probably going to be a little weedsy, I think, in the sense that I'm going to try to show you how a historian works a lot with fragmented material that is like a bunch of puzzle pieces, but you're going to be sort of unsatisfied in the sense that you're going to be working on this big puzzle, and the puzzle has 1,000 pieces, and you found out that you have 789 of them. Actually, maybe even less than that. And so you might have a better understanding of what the puzzle is when you're done, but you'd say, but isn't there more? Because most of these documents, especially for Mesopotamia, are probably talking about the same thing, but they're in isolated and fragmented sources. So let me continue with the Jewish sources. One, Enoch, very, very interesting, very thorough. There is no other text that talks in such great length about the Genesis 6 passage and the Nephilim and the sons of God that come down. But there are a few other Jewish sources. They're also part of the pseudepigrapha that I talked about in the previous episode. These are Jewish intertestamental writings that are very important. They're very interesting, but they do not have the same place as Scripture, and I do not mine them for information. I look at them to understand the Jewish mindset. So I'll say a few more of these texts. And you can also, by the way, go look them up. Each of them are pretty easily accessible now online, so you can find a translation. Sometimes you can find an old translation from over a century ago. Sometimes you'll find newer ones, and you can sort of determine that. I'm not an expert on intertestamental Jewish writings, and so I can't give you advice as to what the best translations are. So let's start off with a source called Book of Jubilees. This is sort of a Jewish commentary, pre-Christian, on much of the Old Testament, especially parts of Genesis. And so a few isolated statements. Now we had a whole narrative in Enoch talking about the sons of God. These texts will confirm that was probably the overriding opinion in the Jewish and Christian world concerning how to interpret Genesis 6. So, for example, we're in book 4 of the Jubilees. Like I said, very interesting text. I don't hold it as scripture, and neither should any of you, in my opinion. So in book 4, it actually gives added information concerning those patriarchs that are mentioned from Adam to Noah, the ones that with all those, long life ages, etc. And of course, we're only told the name of the person and then who her son was that was in the line, as if they only had one son. And occasionally they'll talk about the names of their wives in this particular source. It talks about, for example, Mahalalel, who took unto himself to wife Dinah. That's the same word as Dinah or Dinah in Genesis 34, who came to a pretty bad ending. The daughter of Barachiel, the daughter of his father's brother, and she bare him a son in the 3rd week in the 6th year. And this is connected to the Jubilees, and called his name Jared. For in his days the angels of the Lord descended on the earth, those who are named the Watchers. And so here's a connection. Clearly, this anonymous source is writing with the same type of traditions that we're finding in Enoch about this. In fact, a little bit further down, it even talks a little bit about Enoch and the fact that he wrote down signs of heaven according to their months, and he wrote them in a book. And so this is probably actually referring to the book of First Enoch, because it does talk about Enoch and some of his writings that were written down. I guess writings would be written down, wouldn't they? And then a little bit further down in verse 22, Enoch testified to the watchers who had sinned with the daughters of men, for these had begun to unite themselves so as to be defiled with the daughters of men, and Enoch testified against them. And it continues on with another topic. Now we can move on to book 5, or chapter 5, I suppose, and it simply says in the beginning, and it came to pass when the children of men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the angels of God saw them on a certain year of this Jubilee, that they were beautiful to look on, and they took themselves wives, all of whom they chose, and bare unto them sons, and they were giants. Again, we're not giving any new information. All it's doing is it's confirming information that we had before. And so, again, that's our Jubilee source. Well, we're not done with the Jubilee source. How about the Testament of Reuben? Of course, the pseudonym Reuben, of course, is actually the firstborn son of Jacob, but he, of course, ended up not being the son of the promise. In this is chapter 5, verse 7. Flee therefore fornication, my children, and command your wives and your daughters that they adorn not their heads and faces to deceive the mind, because every woman who uses these wiles hath reserved them from eternal punishment. That's bad. But it's because thus they allured the watchers who were before the flood. For as these continued beheld them, they lusted after them, they conceived their act in their mind, they changed themselves into the shape of men, and appeared to them when they were with their husbands, and then it continued on. And so really what the writer's doing here, sort of obliquely, maybe not that obliquely, is he's blaming the women for this issue. Like if you weren't dressed in such a provocative way, then those angels wouldn't have had cause to come down. Not a good one for present day, that's for sure. So how about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Now, by the way, I almost said Dead Sea Squirrels, because I don't know if you have any kids or grandkids, maybe they're watching the Dead Sea Squirrels show. It's evidently a big hit. I have watched it, couple of them, and I was a bit underwhelmed, but my grandkids really liked them. So in any event, I recommend them highly.
I was unaware of these until about 10 minutes ago.
I'll pray for you.
Thank you.
So anyway, the Dead Sea Scrolls, what are they? To be very brief right now, because maybe we can do another essay or a session on the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. But of course, these were found in the Dead Sea area near Qumran. on a number of caves. This is all just after World War II. Their significance is paramount. Not only did they find copies of Holy Scripture, the Old Testament, that corresponded and became the oldest extant text that we have of the Old Testament, they also found scores and scores of Jewish writings that were put together. And by the way, they probably were placed together under duress to hide them from the incoming invasion by the Romans. And so they were, of course, were never recovered, but the holy texts were put together, again, perhaps indiscriminately, although I'm not a Dead Sea Scroll expert. By the way, here's a nice volume that came out in the 90s on the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the editors is Ed Cook, who actually was a fellow graduate student with me at UCLA. He was already legendary, by the way, back then. So I'm not surprised that he was able to work on the scrolls and edit this really, really, really nice volume. So there are lots and lots of Jewish writings. By the way, the biblical texts agree highly with the late medieval copies that we have, which had been the earliest ones. And so it gave us a hint on the early transmission of the biblical text, at least from the time of Jesus or a little bit earlier to the late Middle Ages. We could see that they had been transmitted rather faithfully, which was an amazing find. And of course, the extra biblical Jewish writings have shed light on many things, and a few hints about the Genesis 6 passage are in them also. So, for example, this is Damascus document 4Q266, pretty boring. And it simply, again, is talking about the whole issue of the sin of lust, and then it compares it kind of like 1 Peter and kind of like Jude to the Genesis 6 passage. By the way, this probably helps us and informs us about the context for both 2 Peter and Jude. For through them great men have gone astray, and mighty heroes have stumbled from former times till now, because they walked in the stubbornness of their heart. The heavenly watchers fell. They were caught because they did not keep the commandments of God, and their sons also fell, who were as tall as cedar trees. Do I hear Nephilim right now? Yes. I almost said Heffalump, and that's going to be your fault again. And whose bodies were like mountains. All flesh on dry land perished. They were as though they had never been, because they did their own will and did not keep the commandment of their Maker, so that his wrath was kindled against them. But this is, again, just an isolated piece of information. We're trying to piece all of these things together. The problem is, be careful about doing that. You don't want to take things out of their original context, because it would be as if somebody asked you, hey, what does the Bible say about divorce? Oh, I'll just look up a concordance and pull out all the divorce passages and create and put them all together. You know what you've just done? You've just created a new theology. Okay? It's much harder to take every passage in their context, so keep them where they are. Doesn't mean you can't use a concordance, of course. So there's also another Dead Sea Scroll text called the Book of Giants. Wow, who knew? Wouldn't that be cool? Well, it's frankly not quite as cool as you would think. It's heavily fragmented. There are about 5 different parchments of it, and they overlap, and they're heavily fragmented. And so we just have a hint here and there of a few things. And so I'll say broken when it's broken. So, for example, here we are in the fragment called 1Q23, fragment 9 plus 14 plus 15. And it simply said, they killed man, broken, they begat giants. All right, so because of context, I'm thinking this is probably talking about the same thing. 4Q531, fragment 2. They defiled it. They begot giants and monsters. They begot something, and behold, the earth was corrupted. I'm going to take a wild guess. They're still talking about the same thing. Okay, I know you got questions. So do I. 2Q26, that means it was in cave number 2. document 26. They drenched the tablet on the waters went up. By the way, here's an editorial comment by the editor of this text. The giants begin to be troubled by a series of dreams. In other words, the giants are getting wind of the fact that the earth's going to be inundated with water pretty soon. And how do they know? Because they got some bad dreams about it. Like something bad's going to happen. What do we do? And so one of them goes to the others and discusses his dream and says, hey, I've got this vision. This is 4Q530 fragment 7, by the way, if you're all up on that stuff. I'm the one who confessed. The whole group of castaways I'll go to and their spirits, and they're all crying out, and we're all going to die together, and this doesn't sound good. So what do? They recognize their futility, and so who do they go to? The only giant that they know of that could help them, although he's not in the Jewish tradition, oddly enough. This is 4Q531, fragment 1. Then Ohia, that's one of the names of the giants, he said, I've been forced to have a dream, the sleep of my eyes vanquished, so let me see this vision. Now I see unbroken, Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh? You mean the guy from Mesopotamia that had all those adventures, and we found out that he was, by the way, Gilgamesh is an Abkallu, so he's going to be connected to the Mesopotamian text that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. He's also connected to this stuff. We didn't expect to find him in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but he's there. There are all sorts of interesting Mesopotamian survivals in not just Dead Sea Scrolls, but also Talmudic sources, and I'll probably be getting to them because it's a lot of commentaries on Leviticus even bring up Mesopotamian sources. So now 4Q530 concerns the death of our souls and all his comrades, and they told them what Gilgamesh said to them, and basically Gilgamesh said, yeah, too bad for you guys. and if you're wondering what happens, so am I, because it says that they, a fragment at the very end apparently detailing a vision that Enoch saw, and that's about it. And of course, we don't know how to put all the fragments together. In other words, we have these 5 fragments. They're pieced together. This is, by the way, this happens all the time with cuneiform studies. You got a fragment of a tablet over here, another one over here. We know they're probably talking about the same thing. It would be as if Keegan came over here and took all my papers and just started ripping all of them up and tossing them around and said, all right, Mark, go and try to figure out how to put them all together. Oh, I forgot to tell you, they're in a different language and a different script. And I'm going to take some of the papers, I'm going to put them in Berlin, and I'm take some other papers, I'm going to put them in Paris, and some others in London, and others in private archives in other places, and you try and figure out how they go together. Anyway, at least the Dead Sea Scrolls were, all together in some caves. So the point is that have I learned a whole lot more? No, the Book of Giants is pretty cool. It just didn't really, it didn't produce, is really what my answer is. Although the fact that it brings up Gilgamesh is like, wait a minute, Gilgamesh is like 2,500 years before this. But his tradition continues on in Mesopotamia. And by the way, they're still writing cuneiform stuff until the end of the 1st century AD. And so, at least as far as we know, and so it's still being operated, and it's pretty obvious that there are Jewish writers who have been trained in the scribal tradition and probably know some things about cuneiform. And we'll probably talk about that one of these days. Not today, it's just a teaser. Right. There is another Jewish writer who talks about this. He's by far the best known Jewish writer of the period, although oddly enough, he was not read by Jews in the Middle Ages at all. In fact, they didn't even know about this guy until the late Middle Ages, when they had a Reader's Digest version of his work. It was called Josephus there. This is Josephus, who, of course, his works did survive. 4 main works an autobiography, a work against Apion. I don't know. I really feel bad for Apion. You think about it. What do we know about Apion, whoever he was? All we know about it is that Josephus wrote a really bad book review about him. All I can think of is that if I find out in 5,000 years, the only thing that survived of my work was a bad book review and nothing else, it's like, wow. I suppose I would want to maybe quote Job, like it better to have not been born.
It's just going to be just your negative comments.
Yes, and nothing else. And so, but fortunately, Josephus also wrote a history of the Jewish wars. He calls them the Jewish wars. I suppose in Vietnam, it wasn't called the Vietnam War, you think. Maybe they called it probably the war against the great American enemy. And of course, he also wrote a gigantic commentary on the Old Testament, a history of his people in Greek for a Jewish audience. And so it's called Antiquities. And by the way, the word there for Antiquities, you all know quite well, it's archaeologia, because the pure meaning of the term literally means a study of old things. And of course, it became the science of digging it up, but literally it's the study of ancient stuff. Anyway, so in his archaeology, in fact, he uses that term. I think Polybius uses it briefly, and I know Thucydides talks and uses that term for early antiquity when he's talking about it. Unfortunately, it did not survive into Latin. It had to be resurrected in the European tradition in the, I think, late 17th century, if I remember. Anyway, you didn't ask, I know. That was bonus.
Yeah, so you beat me to it.
Yes. Okay. I'll slow down here. Josephus writes in his Antiquities, Book 1, verse 73 or thereabouts, he says, "For many angels of God accompanied with women and begat sons that proved unjust and despisers of all that was good, on account of the confidence they had in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those," and then he has a really interesting end statement. He says, "whom the Grecians called giants." And of course, those are the Titans, who, as most of you know, ended up in Tennessee and became a very terrible football team. But I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. You know what he's doing there? He's connecting the Nephilim story to the Titans of Greek mythology. As far as I know, he was the first one to do it. And it's really, really cool if you think about it. And of course, the Titans are also the younger gods who are hybrids who lose and, of course, are chained into outer darkness. And by the way, the Greek mythological traditions are so shockingly similar to Mesopotamia that a classical scholar by the name of Martin West decided to take up Akkadian, and then he wrote this really, really cool book called The East Face of Helicon, where he connects all these things. Another great classical scholar who did this was the recently deceased Walter Burkert. And so if you want to look up some names and find out the interconnections between Greece and Mesopotamia, very, very cool stuff.
So can I ask some follow-ups on some
Please.
dates? So Dead Sea Scrolls, approximately, among scholarship, what are those dated to? You might have already said it.
No, but I in fact, I think I forgot to. They are pre-Christian, and also, but most of them appear to be pre-Christian, probably 2nd and 1st century BC. They are deposited sometime in the 1st century of the Christian era, and of course are there during the destruction and conquest of Judea by the Romans, which would be between around 66 and 73 AD. And so they had been, we're guessing, had been in those caves from that time until they were found post-World War II. And so they are they are roughly contemporary with the pseudepigraphal works that I talked about that are very late Jewish writings, probably 2nd and 1st century BC.
Okay, and then because then the correlation between the Greek and the Mesopotamian myths, what are the differences in dates of those? Assuming like the Greeks copy again, you're getting into whether or not they copied.
Again, it's not a copy issue at all. But if you want to bring that up, the earliest Greek mythical stories are Hesiod and Homer, who are about 8th and 7th century BC. But I have to tell you is that when they began to decipher the linear B material, which is Greek, which is late Bronze Age, though they didn't find any mythical texts, they do find the same names of divine beings that are found in Homer. And so we're guessing the mythical tradition goes back even earlier. Furthermore, when they began to decipher the Hittite material, which is in central Turkey, that's the land bridge between Greece and Mesopotamia, the myths that were found there, both Hittite and Hurrian, another people group in this area, those myths are sort of like the bridge between the Mesopotamian myths and the Greek myths. And they all show a wider Mesopotamian tradition. So just like the Bible, the Greeks aren't copying these cool myths. They're part of the same wider, greater Mediterranean tradition of this material. And so it just happens to be the earliest in Mesopotamia that we found, but the other traditions are there. Of course, the Greeks are Indo-Europeans, as are the Hittites, and so, but they seem to have a common literature tradition, and I'm saying that in the most general way possible. The Mesopotamian stuff is very, very early. The earliest Sumerian mythical stuff is probably mid-3rd millennium, although most of our copies, the earliest copies, come from the Old Babylonian copies in the beginning of the 2nd millennium, Hammurabi period and the like.
Okay. Yeah, because then if you're looking at like the Greek and the Mesopotamian, which I know we haven't touched on, so then in your opinion, is it like, not saying everything in the Greek mythology is like, oh, it's a one-to-one correspondence, but when we're specifically talking about the Nephilim, do you see it as, and I know you mentioned the Titans, like, do they write the Titans because of the truth of the Nephilim, and then through their purview of their lowercase g's gods, like that's how they reconcile it? Like, I'm just like potentially. Do you know what I'm saying? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I know. Okay. You're asking me theological stuff again. And so I'm just going to say that's really, if you think about it, as a historian, I'm simply giving you information. How does this work? How do these traditions find their way? That's a question that is so far removed from the context. Yes, of course, as a Christian, I could say, well, they have these perverted ideas of things that happen. Genesis, of course, gives us the true story. The later Jewish traditions add to it. The Christian writers understand that material. And then we have, of course, outside materials, pagan materials, if you like, that talk about it, just like there's even a Greek version of the flood, too. And so, so how are they getting their versions as opposed to the biblical versions? That's a really, really great question. I hope you don't expect an answer, whether historical or theological. It's really interesting to think about.
I feel like I'll have similar questions almost every episode, but
yes,
because then it's like almost the same discussion we had in Genesis. Like, is it the other side of the coin of, in Genesis, we're seeing some of it as theological messaging, like, oh, you guys thought this happened. Now, again, whether or not certain elements are historical or theological, it's God saying, you thought it was this, but here's what it actually means.
I think
but in the
that
same
happens.
sense of them getting it wrong. But like if there's giants around the world and Nephilim, everybody's going to have their account. But again, if you're worshiping the sun and the moon or whatever, fill in the blank for whatever people group you want to say, like, okay, we see the world through this lens. We're a part of this Mesopotamian continuum. Then they have to reconcile it with their greatest order structure or their deities. I
think that's probably what's going on. Of course, it's not the only reason for Genesis, but it's certainly there that they are showing that, yeah, we understand what the traditions are. They're not 100% false, but we're going to show you the correct interpretation of these traditions. Of course, all of this sums up by Transformers. And who are the bad guys? Are they the Autobots? I'm trying to remember now.
Well, who's the other ones? The Autobot? No, it's not the Autobots.
Are they the good guys? Decepticons. All right. Anyway, clearly somebody in a couple thousand years is going to connect those to the Greek traditions and try to figure all that out. Maybe we should.
It's almost like the game of telephone, because you could make the argument that it's like the game of telephone. This tradition went to this tradition, and now it's like, oh, so that's related, but it's like not really.
But maybe a little more serious. By the way, I forgot one more, and I'll just bring it up real quickly. Apocalypse of Baruch. Now, this one's interesting because Baruch is Jeremiah's recorder. And if you remember, even in the story of Jeremiah, where the king took Baruch's texts and started shredding them. And of course, Baruch is Jeremiah's editor, and sometimes he's probably the commentator of it. But at any point, there is a tradition, again, in 2nd and 1st century about Baruch having his own revelations, and one of them is about the angels. It says in, chapter 56, 10 through 14. This is about children and others. They became a danger to their own soul, even to the angels he became a danger. For moreover, at the time when he was created, they enjoyed liberty, and some of them descended and mingled with women, and then those who did were tormented in chains. The rest of the angels stayed cool. I'm sort of summarizing it up. So again, it's just, we continue having this, and it's pretty uniform, even though, of course, all of these things are rather fragmented. And like I said, if I've got this puzzle up here, I've got a bunch of pieces, and they all seem to be part of the puzzle. I just don't have the full thing yet. I did bring, it's Theogony here to talk about the birth of the gods, and there's 2 verses about the Titans, but it just sort of, I think I already talked about it. So now, so that's the Jewish tradition. By the way, the Jewish tradition begins to change around the 2nd, maybe early 3rd century of the Christian era, where they begin to de-emphasize the idea of the sons of God and daughters of men, of the sons of God being heavenly beings. In other words, they're not, they sort of, they continue to argue it, but at least they've sort of opened up the idea that it's no longer going to be that. And in the early church, however, the concept of them being heavenly beings will continue probably for a couple centuries. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I'm guessing that when both traditions become acquainted with Greek philosophy, they become increasingly embarrassed by it. Maybe that's one of the words to say, is that, I don't know. And of course, this will culminate with Augustine, who will flat out deny that the sons of God are heavenly beings, by the way. And so I want to just look at a couple of these early church writers. Stop me at any point if you're thinking about this. So this is, for example, Justin Martyr, 2nd century early writer and apologist. And so I'm not going to give you the references at this point. If you're really interested, I could put them online. He says, he's talking about Genesis 6. He says, God, when he had made the whole world, subjected things earthly to man and arranged the heavenly elements for the increase of fruits and rotation of seasons, and appointed this divine law. For these things he also evidently made for man, he committed the care of men and all things under heaven to angels, whom he appointed over them. But the angels transgressed this appointment and were captivated by the love of women. Obviously, that's a connection to that. So in other words, God had made all these demarcations, and the angels transgressed the demarcation. That was a no-no. I guess, one of the questions I'm thinking of is like, why did God allow this? And of course, I guess the answer is probably, hey, that's above our pay grade. God allowed a lot of things and even allowed us to sin. So why not the angels? Irenaeus is cool. He was a student of Polycarp, who was a student of John the Apostle, which is really, really cool. And so Irenaeus was writing, and he says, For a long while, wickedness extended and spread, reached and laid hold of the whole race of mankind until a very small seed of righteous remained among them, and illicit unions took place upon the earth, since angels were united with the daughters of the race of mankind, and they bore to them sons who were for their exceeding greatness. They were called gigas, giants. Okay, so that continues on. Clement of Rome has a long statement about that. He's a little bit later. Actually, he's not. He's still first century. Then we finally get to Augustine. I'm not going to bring it up, but I again, Augustine is, he's the greatest Christian thinker of the Middle Ages. Basically, especially Western Christian thinking. That would be, of course, primarily Catholic, but not exclusively. From then on, by the way, his dates are about 354 to 430. He wrote two masterpieces that became staples. In fact, they're even Penguin paperbacks, The City of God, which basically was a theological justification for the fact that we've basically left the pagan deities of Rome. And it just so happens that he lived during the fall of Rome. Rome was sacked in 410, and the pagans are all saying it's because of the Christian God that this happened. We forsook our gods. And so basically, Augustine wrote a letter to the editor, gone amok. It became about 1,100-page letter to the editor, proving that no, we did not forsake those gods. They weren't gods. They were demonic. The true God is the one we're dealing with here. And by doing it, he wanted to de-emphasize anything that was connecting any of the heavenly beings in the Bible to either demonic or influence. And so he de-emphasizes the Genesis 6 and makes it into earthly beings who are now literally called heroes and giants, etc. And the church pretty much went with it since then.
Was he in the minority still amongst other theologians? But him obviously having the absolute
interesting
biggest voice.
that his contemporary, older contemporary Ambrose, was still of the opinion of the giants. Now, by the way, the closer we get to the present, the less comfortable I am with. And so now, we're actually sort of escaping late antiquity and going into the early medieval, which, by the way, I find really fascinating, but I don't have a lot of things intelligent to say about it. And so all I'm telling you is that with Augustine, we have a commentary tradition that begins to change. And by the way, when I say that, I'm not saying that every time a commentary tradition changes, we need to go back to the earlier one. They're always correct. It just so happens that in this particular context, the commentary tradition is based upon the commentary in the New Testament, which we cannot avoid. And after we're doing this, by the way, we're going to enter into classical Mesopotamia, then into Mesopotamia proper, or maybe improper. Go for it. I know I can see all the wheels turning there.
Well, yeah, because I just think, so that's like the big pivotal moment, especially when it comes to the Nephilim, but I would imagine also overall of less and less of like the supernatural. And
yeah, that's one way to put it, but I don't want to go any further with that because again, I'm not trained in Christian commentary tradition in the early church to,
because that's what I've
say
heard.
that.
It's like, even if he wasn't, again, it was starting to move that way, but Augustine is an absolute powerhouse. So then it picks up so much steam. He's the major voice, and so it kind of shifts. It shifts. But then my other question would be, okay, we look at the other people. We look at Irenaeus. We look at the other church fathers. For somebody even like a modern commentator, where's their justification? Like outside of like Augustine? Like when you're looking at, like, it seems, and of course I'm sure they can find other things, but it seems so uniform up until about 350.
I'll tell you what I think. And by the way, Augustine, one of the last thing I want to bring up, he's got a foot in the New Testament and he's got a foot reading Paul because he loved, he was a pagan who converted to Christianity in his maturity, in his 30s. He had lived a full life. And so, and he was one of the first to embrace the New Testament, embrace the Bible as Holy Scripture, but not to reject his Greek tradition as completely unholy, improper. And so the good things from Plato and Aristotle, others, he could draw in. Now that was different, for example, than Tertullian 2 centuries earlier, who said the famous line, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" In other words, I was a pagan and I'm rejecting it completely, and I'm embracing my new faith, which, by the way, often happens to new believers who might have been embroiled in, other traditions, and they reject them outright. And Augustine would have said, God made the universe, and the universe has truth and beauty in it. And even the pagans, the Gentiles, had truth and beauty. It just means that it was misdirected, and I can help direct it. So anyway, and that's why I think in many respects, without Augustine, we would have had trouble embracing our Judeo-Christian and our Greco-Roman traditions. And by the way, when you mold the two together, you get medieval Christianity, which is what we come from. Now, why did that secular tradition continue? Part of it, I think, is we became comfortable with it, but we became even more comfortable during the scientific revolution, which, if you think about it, we can't help being a part of. There's no way we're not a part of it. Even those who are the most religious of people, we think like the scientific revolution. Even the things that happen on earth, we think of them in a natural way. We think that God works in the world, but in a subtle way. If I let go of these papers and they stay up, I'm not going to run out and say the hand of God was on them to hold them up. I would probably first try to find a natural reason for why the law of gravity seems to be suspended or anything that happens. It doesn't mean I don't believe in miracles. It just means that I'm predisposed to looking for the natural reason for something that happens. This is the 17th century way of thinking. And it is so immersed, it is embedded in our deepest consciousness along with our faith tradition. So they've been merged together. And when you merge them together, you're always looking for a scientific, rational reason for something. And that's really easy to do with Genesis 6. And by the way, I think I already said this a couple of podcasts before. I fought this, and I still have tension with this. I'm telling you what I think the text says and what it means. And as a historian, it's almost as if I can now drop the ball and let theologians deal with this problem. But since I'm a believer, I have to deal with it too. Even if I'm not trained in theology, I have to look at it from a theological standpoint and say, all right, and now what does this mean if this is true? It means that I have a deeper understanding of what's really going on in the heavenly realm with God, and realize that when God is interacting with human beings, when Paul hints about principalities and powers and other things, that there's a whole lot more going on out there that we're not privy to, and we probably won't be privy to, and we probably couldn't bear it. And so we have these little hints here and there. I probably already mentioned this before.
Yeah, because so then I would see it as like this subset, Nephilim being one of the parts of this rise in materialism or the material world, as opposed to the supernatural or the spiritual realm, like what you said, which is Paul makes a strong emphasis on. We don't war against flesh and blood, but the powers and the principality. Like this, and Mike Heiser's big up this spiritual war, and there's so much more. I don't want to say more, but there's so much going on behind the scenes that we don't see. And almost like the spiritual realm in the world you can't see is sometimes more real than the world that you do see. What's going on behind the curtain.
And you think of somebody like Mike Heiser, what he did was he basically, here's all this stuff just sort of laying low, and he basically ran through it and caused all the dust to come up. And you know why he did it? Because he was a Bible believer who started studying all this stuff and said, you know something, if this stuff is supposed to be taken at face value, what does Psalm 82 really mean? What does Psalm 46 really mean? When it talks about the sons of God, wait a minute, this is like this passage and that passage, and if you actually take them for face value, they're talking about heavenly things, not earthly things. And it's like, and you know, when he did all this, it wasn't a shock to Mesopotamian scholars and other ancient Near Eastern scholars, most of whom perhaps were not interested in belief systems, but they said, oh, well, yeah, that's the biblical writers are writing just like the Mesopotamians are about this stuff. They just hadn't made the close connections, and nobody on the biblical side had, especially those who are Bible believers, had made that connection and then put it in a public venue like Mike did. And so he's, and he would have told you, and if he were able to be here right now, you know, he would say, I was not an innovator. I was simply interpreting the way that other scholars had interpreted, and I collected it together and put it in a venue that was now accessible to the general populace. And then, of course, it exploded.
Yeah. Because then beyond that, do you see the at least simultaneously, like, is this, I think you used a pretty good word, which is like embarrassed, maybe not the perfect word, but again, we're shying away and lowering our standard of the spiritual realm. Do we see the same time that we start walking away from Nephilim being these angelic hybrids, that when we start seeing, and I know we'll probably touch on this when we talk about like Babel and stuff, but like this idea of, well, no, there's no other like angelic or supernatural beings in charge of nations, and we just always say, well, all the other gods they're just fake gods. There's one true God, but no other, almost like no other spiritual beings, as opposed to these other spiritual beings actually are doing stuff and having power, but we just see, well, it's God and Satan and nothing else.
I think you're absolutely right. That's how I was trained, and so I think that so they were summarily dismissed over a long period of time, and so in many respects, we have received sort of a sanitized view. And I'm not saying that it's theologically wrong. We have all the basics right, in my opinion, but there's an undercurrent here that has been ignored, or at least, and it's not so much that it's suppressed. I mean, the pastors who go to seminary aren't trained to talk about this thing. It's not that like they're purposely hiding this stuff.
Yeah, it's not like a cover up.
No, not at all. Not at all. And so, but of course, the dust is now all up, and it's sort of ruffled feathers and all of that. And here I am as a text person. All I can do is look at it and then and evaluate it critically. And this is what the text says. What does that mean? Oh, yeah, what does this mean to me if the text says that? That's the one that we now need to wrestle with because of all that.
Yeah. And then even with me sitting down and meeting with you, that's been the wrestle with for me. as more of a charismatic person, I'm a little bit maybe more open to the spiritual realm, or it's not the best way to put it, but you know what I mean, like the supernatural, as compared to some of the evangelical world. But even that other stuff, yeah, it was just this. Oh, I always had this assumption. Well, they're worshiping just fake deities, false idols, fake. It's like a bronze. It's just a bronze statue. There's nothing behind it. But then all of a sudden you start diving into this Mesopotamian world, and again, there is so much more to, quote Mike Heiser's book, the unseen realm, the spiritual world, the supernatural, way more than what meets the eye, and way more than we understand, which makes so much sense. Because the one phrase, once I started it took me a little while, but to try to take my Western hat off, and the more I looked at it, all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, when God starts using phrases like, I'm the most high God, worship no other gods before me. Well, then you're like, okay, if it's just God and just fake all fake stuff, well, then how does that make any sense with like phrases like the Most High God?
Well, because the term Elohim is talking about function, not nature. Okay, and so God can be the highest of all the Elohim, but we're still monotheists, because even though he's called with the same name, for us, it's rather unfortunate that he's called, by the way, the term Elohim is plural, figure that one out, and it's often used with it can be used with a plural verb or a singular verb, and so it's really confusing, but the term is also used for the gods of the nations. It's also used for the sons of God, which are in his heavenly court. It's all the same word, and so you've got to figure out how they're used in context. If the word in the intrinsic meaning of the word is not God,
yep,
it's powerful one, or perhaps though it's not. This isn't the literal meaning for it, but the practical application is to talk about heavenly beings.
Yep.
Okay, and the heavenly beings are all lumped together as Elohim. There is one great Elohim who is wholly apart and different from all the others, and we know that by, in a subtle way, when we simply read all of Scripture, we realize that the great Elohim, Yahweh himself, is wholly apart and different from everything else because he's the creator. And does he create everything out of nothing? Well, that's not the purpose of Genesis 1 like I talk about, but you can put two and two together and figure all that out, that this Elohim is completely and thoroughly different. And so the concept of Jewish monotheism still stands. Although someone like Abraham, we're going to talk about him, and I'm going to look at some of the passages about him, especially Genesis 15, where I'm working on something. But I'm convinced that Abraham probably understood God and his exclusivity in stages, because he probably couldn't have bared the whole truth all at once. You know, can you imagine God coming down and say, "I'm the only God, there aren't any other gods"? No, that's not how he operated with Abraham. He started off by interacting with him, becoming, in a sense, his personal God, telling him that he's going to have a special dispensation for him. And even though Abraham himself didn't do anything to deserve it, as far as I can tell, and Abraham believed, and then as time went on, they're continuing on in their pagan traditions, and they're adding, Jewish monotheism to it. Do they ever get there in Genesis? No. That's why I'm so convinced Genesis is historical, because the writers decided to keep all the warts in there, even though it looked embarrassing, because their patriarchs weren't really acting like good Mosaic type monotheists. Well, duh. But you think about it. Maybe I would have let's sanitize this because it might be embarrassing, later on. No, they didn't do that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And then I think that's why it's difficult in forums or discussions like this, because you say gods, but then that's why you always have to revert back to, lowercase g's. Otherwise people, because yes, one true God in a class of his own. But then it's also the language that they're using, but also probably why God, Yahweh, is saying it the way, because they're thinking these other supernatural or divine beings are gods, but God's saying, no, I'm the one true God. Now they are supernatural beings, but he's the only
But there's only
God,
one like him.
which is why
Yes.
it's like the easiest way to put it, uppercase G, lower, like, okay, angelic beings, supernatural beings, but one God, but he's set apart.
You would have asked, those writers in biblical Hebrew, couldn't you have made up a new word for the holy apart being, the German phrase ganz andere, the holy other. But it didn't happen, and it caused confusion. Of course, it still causes confusion because in English, when we think of the word God, we think of an otherworldly, extraterrestrial being, God. And so when you use it for all these other terms, you're thinking, well, they're all lumped together. And of course, that was the confusion that has occurred, especially with those, even with scholars who would work with the Jewish tradition, but not really understand the intricate nature of biblical Hebrew and what these words meant. Because even the term Most High God is found with the material at Ugarit, a Canaanite town. Well, pretty much a Canaanite town. So another confusing thing. So are we ready for Mesopotamia? Or
that was a pretty fun bunny trail. But no, I would say no. I'd say let's hold off and wait on the Mesopotamian tradition. Maybe you can tease them with, I assume, is there going to be some Gilgamesh stuff coming up?
Very briefly, just Gilgamesh is just a side show on this, and very tiny side show. If you thought the Dead Sea Scrolls were funny puzzle pieces, I'm going to give you. This is going to be a Lego box for ages 100 and up with 10,000 pieces, but I took 9,000 of the pieces away, and I'm going to throw them in a bunch of different libraries, and you have to go find them. And so and not only that, we don't know how they are put together. Mesopotamia has a tradition about angelic beings who came down and intermarry with human folk. The Mesopotamian beings who do that are called the Great Wise Ones. The term in Akkadian is Abkallu. It's a loan word from Sumerian. The Abkallu. One Mesopotamian scholar who I mentioned, I think in the last episode, her name was Anne Draftcorn Kilmore, began to make the connection in one of her graduate seminars at UC Berkeley in the 80s between the Nephilim and the Abkallu. Unfortunately, she wrote it in an obscure article in the 80s, which is not easily accessible. But she began to make that connection. But again, pointy-headed Mesopotamian scholars, and she was really nice. She didn't have a pointy head. But those of us who do have pointy heads, we usually are working on our own for our other three friends that know Mesopotamian stuff. And we're not very good at exposing this material to the public. This is why someone like Mike Heiser, who's taken this stuff, he's not a Mesopotamian scholar, but he knew where to find the stuff. And that put my antenna up, and I started looking first at his Reversing Harmon book and thinking, he's got a whole chapter on Mesopotamian stuff. Wait a minute, and I'm looking, these are all good. These are all the right sources. He nailed every single one. It's all the right stuff. He read all the right people. Good for him. I wasn't surprised, though. But the point is that there's no one manual talking about this stuff. It's isolated here, isolated there, over about a 2,000-year period, and it's really strange. You'll find a statement about the Abkallu, who, by the way, are now in the underworld. They've been chained down there because they were bad. The fact that they intermarried isn't necessarily the bad thing for Mesopotamia, but they're chained down there, and guess what they do? To summarize, the Abkallu are in the underworld. They do interact. They do intermarry with humans, or they cohabit with them, and the product are 2/3 divine. They're not called Nephilim or whatever, but they clearly are the same type of tradition. And they're the ones who give civilization to humans through crafts and magic, incantations. And so, of course, for the Jews, this is really, really bad stuff. But even for Mesopotamia, the Abkallu, who are usually good because they gave us good stuff, a lot of them went bad. And so if you have something bad happen to you and you need somebody to do an incantation, you're actually calling against the Abkallu, and you call them out by name. And in the last one I'm going to read, just as a teaser, if you have an evil demon that has entered into your house, you actually have to go and make 7 images of the Abkallu. You better be good at making things out of clay. And it's almost like a voodoo doll type thing. You know, what do you think about? What is a voodoo doll? It's the image of the person that you want to bother, and you start sticking things in them. And, you know, I stick something in the image of Keegan. He's going to start hurting in the voodoo tradition. Well, that actually comes from Mesopotamia somehow. And so they're doing this with Abkallu. So they're bad guys. And so I'll start reading those texts, but you'll be unsatisfied in the sense that there'll be a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, and then that's it.
Right when we start get going, then all of a sudden you'll.
Although I remember I told you, I already showed you this book the other day, Josephine Fechner, In Search of the Seven Sages. So this is primarily concerning all the material commentary, but also the iconographic. By the way, they look like fish heads. There's 7 of them usually. They got fish heads and human bodies, and go figure. And there's a tradition, but unfortunately, if there is a full-blooded, full-blown tradition about them, it has not survived. And so they're never the main topic of anything.
All right, well, awesome. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you have questions, feel free to email us, drop them below. Otherwise, make sure to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time where we talk about the fish heads and the Abkallu and find some other cool bunny trails.